is my thoughts on the whole thing based on what I just saw coming back from out there. Because when I did my live stream from Ukraine, um, I was not particularly impressed with the Russian soldiers' way of waging war by any means, given what I've seen. And one thing is casualties that mount up from fighting in a built-up area. Another thing is outright shooting point blank at civilians. I will absolutely agree with what Michael said. We are looking at a frozen conflict where the Russians, they just don't have what it takes to move forward, and the Ukrainians don't have what it takes to kick the Russians out. That's pretty much where things are. And it's been brought up that, well, the Russians have, could theoretically call up 30 million soldiers, and that's true, they could. The Ukrainians can certainly also call up a whole lot more soldiers as well. There's a lot of young Ukrainian weapons grade men in the hinterland of Ukraine, and there's a lot of volunteers that are signing up, regardless of what you hear, however that goes, pro or con. The Russians can't call up 30 million people because they haven't declared war. There's still a limited military action. Their constitution won't allow them to do so. That's, of course, something you can switch with a little bit of handwriting. You can change you can change that and call them all up. But does Russia have, given what we've seen of some of the old and faulty equipment that the Russians have been issued to their troops, and what they have been pulling out of storage that we can verify with satellite imagery, that I will at some point in time start breaking down. Do the Russians have enough weaponry to equip 30 million people? Well, 30 million people is never going to show up. Say a million more. I don't think they do. I don't think the Ukrainians have, if they could call up a million young men, I don't think they have enough gear to equip a million or more men. So it now boils down to who can make the most, who can create the most of equipment. This is slowly becoming a manufacturing war, where the Russians are also running through, or have been running through, a vast amount of artillery shells, eroding their barrels and their systems. Thus, they've been pulling more and more out of mothballing. And they have been allocating less and less munitions to their frontline troops. So the Russians are not in the great shape that we are seeing. And I'm certainly not a big fan of Vladimir Putin's gamble here in Ukraine. Absolutely not. And I'm certainly not. I am disgusted with the way individual Russian units have behaved themselves in the killing and raping of civilians. And I'm saying that because I've been to the places where they've done it, and I've spoken to the people who've been victimized by it. So I don't want to hear the nonsense about this is propaganda one way or another. There are atrocities that have happened, and the problem with atrocities that have happened is, when Russian soldiers does it, that will embitter Ukrainian soldiers, and then they will pay them back in toll, and then the Russian soldiers will see that, and then it becomes a spiraling motion where everybody's doing horrible things to each other's civilians or sympathizers or soldiers, and that's why this has to stop. And seeing the peace deal unfold, that's my problem. Like, I don't have I actually don't have any particular pros or cons when it comes to Zelensky, because I don't know him. I haven't really followed his rise or his support or not. I don't know that much about him, or his motivations, or how or what or why. So I'm seeing him as a person who's sitting in a very hard position, because his position right now is, a lot of his people will not let him undertake a peace negotiation, because they will not accept that they have lost. I believe that the Ukrainians, to a large extent, have lost a large percentage of the territory that the Russians are now occupying, because the Russians will not give it up under any circumstances. That would lead Putin to lose face. And he does, to some degree, Putin, have a popular opinion in Russia that he does have. I don't quite agree with Michael that he's not he's not a dictatorship as such. It is certainly a top heavy um, system where, okay, here's the problem that Russia is having. If we have to dissect Russia a little bit, yes, it's not exactly a democracy. And yes, you don't exactly want dissent going on in Russia, because then you get locked up or sent to the front. So that makes it a little bit of one-sided. However, you see in Russia over the past year a very frank, a very open debate, conversation, and outright insane arguments between military. You had Prigozhin and Shoigu have been arguing out loud in the mass medias. You have Russian generals who seemed competent, who have been complaining out loud, backwards up to the channel of horrible supplies and munitions and tactics, and corrupt commanders. You see a lot of Russian commanders and generals that have been removed, and some magically, interestingly, died for complaining about the system. But here you have to look at the system that is protecting itself. And this is where you now have to look at the way, and this is very interesting, the way Putin is running his seat of power is not unsimilar to the way Hitler ran his seat of power, by hiring acceptably competent people who absolutely cannot stand each other. Meaning you have a whole lot of people who are now infighting against each other within his system, because that means a smart person. Well, let's take a look for a minute at what do you actually have in Russia. You have a string of military PMCs. You have Wagner, who received a large amount over the year of Russian military production weaponry and so on. You also have Shoigu, which is the defense minister, who has his own PMC, because in what world does a defense minister not have his own private military arm? Of course he does. And then there's a whole lot of other, like you have, well, the PMC Patriot is his. You have the Luhansk militia, for ones. You have those militias that are really sprung up to some degree. It's in the 1940s, in the 2014, where is all the shootings on the perimeters really started and slowly escalated. But you have all these different entities that are receiving military weaponry, munitions. You have Rosgvardia, which is I guess you could say it's the next evolution of a KGB style security intelligence organization, which is at this point, Rosgvardia is the internal security police. Let's put it that way. They have almost 1,700 armored vehicles and tanks and their own artillery brigade, because what internal security police doesn't need that? They can also, by presidential decree, take over individual military units. They are commanded by Putin's former chief of police, who's also Yeltsin's bodyguard, by the way. That's one of his bodyguard units. They are loyal to him. Shoigu is loyal to Yeltsin, to Putin, because Putin is Yeltsin, and because Putin is loyal to Shoigu, which is why Wagner couldn't really dislodge him in their dash for Moscow. Not that Wagner's run to Moscow was not about getting rid of Putin or overthrowing the regime. It was to get rid of Shoigu, very much to get rid of the military leadership, which they have had a beef with, public beef, since 2018. But you have all of these individual entities that are powerful, that are armed, and who can't figure out to work together or stand each other. Instead, you could say, well, for the greater good of what Russia should do is unite all of this under the umbrella of the Russian army and give them all of the resources and competent leadership under one singular command with one singular goal of doing whatever it is they want to do. But you can't have that in Russia. If you have one singular entity that is all powerful and run by intelligent people, it true to Russian tradition, may have been found that they might actually disagree with you and kick you out. So Putin can't really have one strong, united entity. Instead, he did a little bit like what Hitler did. Have a whole lot of different entities that are infighting underneath you. They can't stand each other, so they're not going to unite and get rid of you. That is what Russia is looking. That is a little bit like what the Russian military is looking like. You have had a lot of corruption all the way down to the ranks where the lower soldiers being paid horrible money have literally just started selling off their equipment because, well, they don't get paid any. And everyone else above them are selling their stuff and defense contracts and all these things. And the attempts of cleaning up the corruption, well, they were also accused of corruption and fired. So now you're looking at it last year, Russian military rolling into a war where they were generally not prepared for this battle, certainly didn't think it was going to take this long. And they got stopped by a very determined Ukrainian defense. Yes, the war has been going on in the eastern parts on those borders since 2014. And so you could say this is what's the next evolution of that, where it very much seems from what I have seen to the very point where the Bank of Moscow transferred a large amount of cash to the Bank of Moscow in Kiev in order to pay the troops once they got there. They were that confident, but they didn't give their troops, the Russian troops rolling in. And you're looking at about some 60, 70, 80,000 from three different prongs of soldiers that were converging on Kiev one way or another, where some of them were literally told, you are going this way, drive to Kiev, follow the truck behind you, you'll get instructions when you get there. They were issued with maps that was 40 years old and food and munitions for a day or two, for 2 or 3 days. So logistics broke down horribly in Russia. They were not prepared. Some of the Russian soldiers their columns ran through small Ukrainian cities without even being locked and loaded. That is not how you start an invasion unless you are certain from your intelligence that you are going to lose. Hold the questions for a minute. I just have to get all this off my chest, and then I'll take your questions. This is where that went. The Russian completely miscalculated. Putin was, from what I'm seeing, informed by his intelligence that this was going to be a pushover. Zelensky was going to leave. They were going to install a new government and do all this, fix what they were going to fix. And when you talk about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, it's very that's threatening Russia. It's very interesting because when Prigozhin came out publicly and said he was going to run to Moscow and get rid of these people, he made it very clear in his talk that there are no Nazis. There's no threat to Russia. The Russian numbers of casualties told to the Russian people have been deflated horribly. And he made a whole lot of other statements that are very hard to unhear after hearing him say that, because that seems to have been the ground of his beef for the longest time. And considering the gentleman that is running the military operations for Wagner has little SS tattoos on his shoulder as well, they must certainly be the right people to know. And I'm saying that slightly smirkingly because you see Russian units also in Russia, some of the militia units running around with death heads insignia as well. The whole Nazi influence is we now live in a world where anybody who does anything patriotic will be declared a Nazi. And yes, you have tons of SS and swastika symbols waving around on that front by apparently everybody, if you actually look it up. I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing that as nationalists fighting other nationalists who have difference of opinions. You have a eastern part of Ukraine that is more Russian-minded. And I'm not making that up. I'm taking that from what I have been told by the Ukrainians themselves. It is still a part of Ukraine. It is still within the Ukrainian border of that everybody decided to by the Budapest Memorandum to uphold these borders. And that's what Zelensky is trying to hold out for. He wants the borders from that time back. And I don't think that's going to happen because militarily, no one can make that happen. And the Russians are not. You can then say, well, if there happened to be a regime change in Russia, will that collapse the front and happen? It might. I don't think there is a regime change coming in Russia. I don't think Putin is going anywhere. Um, I don't think there's a threat to his power as it is. I thought, generally thought that and I was there when this happened. I was sitting in Kiev and we're all watching Wagner shoot down Russian helicopters, which is in Russia, which is very, very awkward. Um, and you would think that either Shoigu or Prigozhin, one of them had to go after this. You can't have this showdown and they both stay alive and in power, and they did. Although Wagner has now moved to Belarus, but they are still where they are, although they pulled out of that line of battle. You have to remember Wagner is represented in a lot of different foreign nations where they're upholding Russian interests. Why that's still happening, I don't know. I would be surprised if one of them doesn't happen to have an accident soon, and I would probably bet. Now, Prigozhin and Putin goes way back, all the way back to when he was catering and having casinos, having to deal with it, getting the permissions for the casinos by Putin. So they go way back, and there's money exchange, of course. Shoigu, however, he has survived in every purge and served every Russian government since '93, or since '91 actually. He came from nowhere, became a 4-star general relatively quickly, and he's a perfect bureaucrat. And I think Prigozhin miscalculated the fact that Shoigu was a political animal who's very good at surviving in a political animal. Whether he's good at his job or not doesn't really matter. He protects the system. And he was instrumental in putting Putin in power back then in the piss up with Yeltsin and so on. That means Yeltsin and Shoigu have a past, and they always owe each other. That makes it hard for him to get kicked out. And I think that was a miscalculation on Prigozhin's side, where he should have realized. And again, I wonder if maybe he was given the impression by other Russian commanders that he had more support than he did. Certainly, there's lots of Russian oligarchs and rich people and tops of heads of state that fled Moscow when they were rolling that way. And there was no seemingly interest by the Russian people to care either way, which is also interesting, which means there's not a whole uprising by the Russian civilians to protect Putin or the system, or to support Wagner and that system. But when you see the Russians, when they rolled into Kiev and crossed the border into Ukraine proper, escalating the war, which is what happened, you can argue that there's a lot of things that pushed Russia to do what they said they were going to do if NATO did what they said they were going to do and what they did. At this point in time, I don't really care. That's a forensic conversation about afterwards. Is like, could we have avoided this situation? What could we have done different? Was NATO expansion part of this? All the little intricacies, I don't care. Right now, there's a war and people are dying, and we need to find the best resolution. What is that resolution? But when you saw the Russians, they rolled in towards Kiev, thousands of civilians rose and wanted arms to go fight the Russians. It was indeed a very large number of territorial soldiers that new recruits had signed up and joined when that war was declared in 23, with 3-4 weeks of training. They ran out and actually slugged it out with the Russians, supported by a few Ukrainian officers. There's of course, there's also a lot of Ukrainians that fled, and you see them all over Europe, and they're not particularly popular because your country's at war and you're 25, high-speed, high-grade, short haircut, muscular young man, and you're sitting in Warsaw with your stripper girlfriend driving on your AMG with spending all your money. That doesn't look good, because why are we giving you all that money? Why are you not at home fighting? When I see a 70-year-old man with his AK and his tennis shoes guarding an infrastructure post in Kiev, and I'm seeing a 25-year-old dudes in the gym in Europe, like, why are you not back home taking granddad's place? Why are you not standing guard in your country? That literally pisses me off. There's always those people. There's also some 10,000 Russians who fled Russia because they didn't want to get called up. But still, Russia is meeting their recruitment goals for what they are seeing. But I think no one can recruit. There's lots of young men in Ukraine that could be called up and could be trained. They could be trained on weekends. There's a lot of things I would do if I was in command of a National Guard unit or territorial militaries or overall policy for military training and recruitment in the Ukraine. There's a lot of things I would do different than what I'm seeing them do. I would start training all weapons grade young men in basic military tactics on weekends. Start them now. Come in 2 days a week. Just get them up to date. So if they have to be called, they have some pre-knowledge or some. That's what I say. There should be a recruitment in every. There should be a year's military service for all Western countries. The Chinese are teaching their young kids how to shoot guns and rockets. The Russian, I guarantee, if you're 13 in Russia, you can shoot an RPG and an AK-47. We have young people at 15 who can't even open a can of food. We are heading towards a situation that is unsustainable, and that's due to Western leadership. But that's a different thing. Anyway, I think you all know sort of where I stand and what pisses me off and anything that happens. And that's another thing in Ukraine. Ukraine has a problem when it comes to dealing with an underlying culture of corruption, just like the Russians do, but they do. And that is something that has to be addressed. And there's also a human smuggling issue that needs to be addressed. And that's one of the things I would like to see Ukraine address. I have lots of Ukrainian friends. And I'm even thinking about getting a little summer house in Poland. I have lots of Polish friends. Love the Polish people, love the Ukrainian people. I have lots of Russian friends. I love the Russian people. And I have a really hard time in my mind when I sit with my Russian friends who are, I don't know anybody who's in favor of this war, who's supporting this that's going on in Russia. I don't think there's a general support. Yes, the Poles will say one thing, and Putin is popular and all that. That's fine, but I don't think there's any sitting down private Russian civilians that I know who's in favor of this war. Of course, if they have lost, and the Russians are losing a lot of men and women. Well, not many women. They're losing a lot of men. They are probably a lot more than. Certainly more than the Ukrainians are losing. They say, well, the Russians they can afford it. Well, yeah, but at some point in time, when enough Russian men come home in boxes, there's going to be more and more unhappiness, and the families to those who have been lost, obviously, interestingly enough, you see them more and more in favor of the war because they need to believe that their sons or husbands or brothers died for a worthwhile cause, which is another way of doing it. But it's still messy, and it's still something that absolutely needs to change. And our way of supplying the Ukrainians needs to change. But also you also have the training requirement. You can train somebody to fight fairly well in a T-72 tank in 8 months. But it takes 3 years to teach somebody successfully to operate a Bradley or an Abrams. An Abrams or a Leopard, because of all the technical that comes with it. The overall, all the computer stuff that we have in our tanks that the Russians really haven't matched yet. So anyway, all right, now let's get on to your actual question. That's why I wanted you to hold on, because I wanted to actually get my say in there for a minute. And Jansen, yeah, I'm sorry about your dad, dude. That just shit. So every dead Russian soldier, there's dead Ukrainian soldiers. I don't believe that statistic. I really don't believe that statistic. I don't, and that's the problem we're having, is we're not getting any proper information. You really have to break down a lot of information to find out what's really going on, who's really winning and who's really losing. Because face value, it's almost impossible. When you listen, you need to stop listening to the news, and you need to start looking at obituaries in the individual countries. Yes, the Ukrainians, after the first month, they lost 14,000 soldiers after the invasion just started. Certainly, the Ukrainians are losing a lot of people, but I think the Russians are losing more because the Ukrainians are generally far more motivated than the individual. If you take them man by man, um, the Russian soldiers are less motivated on average than the Ukrainians are, especially now that they're seeing this turning into a bit of a quagmire. So, um, all right, yeah, never look at mainstream news because there's like I'm fearing this is a moneymaker for everybody, and that is what really grinds me is that there's young men on all sides that are dying as Ukrainian women that are being abused, there are children that are dying and being trafficked in the middle of a war that seems to be just as interested in making everybody money. Because there's a lot of money going on here, and if you look at the last appropriation bill for money to that went to the Ukraine effort, some of that money went to Africa and other places, building dams, doing other things, which is, well, where's the money going? We must have oversight. Yes, we absolutely. If I look at the Budapest Memorandum, yes, it may not technically specifically say we guarantee, but that is most certainly the takeaway that the Ukrainians had from this. And generally, we all signed and promised to guarantee their frontier one way or another. And you can quibble about the semantics because that's the understanding that the parties had walking away. And we haven't done so. I don't want to hear the conversation. We've also been training Ukrainian soldiers for the past 2+ years. So I don't want to hear about us not stop supplying them anything like that. I don't think I'm wrong, Martin. I do think more Russian soldiers than Ukrainians have died. And I'm not entirely sure I'm confident at what Mr. Ritter and Mr. Douglas are actually saying. Because it seems they have also made claims that are so insanely outrageous that, I mean, I don't know how many times have the Ukrainian Air Force been destroyed, like 10 times over. They lost 250,000 men. They didn't have that to start with. So when you start making claims that more people are dying than, or more tanks are destroyed than there actually were to begin with, I'm just saying I would like to see some real numbers. And when I'm in Ukraine, I'm not seeing a diminished resolve. And I'm not seeing a general call up of all the hundreds of thousands of young men that are still in school, in restaurants, working their service jobs in hotels. If the Ukrainians were losing hundreds of thousands of men, well, why aren't they calling up an equivalent hundreds of thousands of men to replace them? There's no general mobilization in Ukraine, and Lord knows Ukraine, they are facing an existential crisis. They have all the motivation to keep fighting, especially now, because they know what happens if they stop or if they give up, if they lose the war. So I don't think I don't think we can take those claims at 100% face value because they just don't hold up. And then you can start looking at, well, what are the Russians pulling out of their inventory? And they're also pulling out a lot of older stuff. I know there's the claim that they're running T-55s again. The T-55 is the real, well, there's not one of the predecessors to T-72 and has a 100mm cannon, which is not really good enough. But I don't think we can. They also, artillery pieces is far more important, and the Russians are pulling a lot of artillery pieces out of storage because they're running through barrels. I mean, one thing is great. You had this year of firing hundreds of thousands of shells, but the barrels were out, and that's just an attrition you have to take into account. How many are they making? Now you have to look at the Russian military infrastructure. How many are they making versus? Yes, we are gradually in the West beginning to supply. We are sort of waking up. And like I said, the benefit of everybody making money is that now there's going to be less of an argument about having weapons manufacturers start producing more weapons and shells. Also, we have hundreds of thousands of cluster munitions and artillery shells that we were going to decommission. We could send them forthwith because we're going to get rid of them anyway. So there's plenty I honestly I don't know a whole lot about Scott Ritter. I know from what I look at it looks like he had a really bum deal. He was trying to point attention to something, and he seemed to have gotten screwed somehow. I don't know exactly what the story is, but that's sort of my memory is that he was trying to point out to the administrations that something wasn't the way they said, and he sort of got sidelined. But I don't know enough about his story to know. Um, how effective was the Ukrainian destruction of the various ammunition? I think they're becoming quite good at it. We have sent them. I mean, the Russians have a lot of respect for the HIMARS because they're doing a phenomenal job. They really are, to the point where they name and even the Patriot systems. And I actually know a Patriot operator here in the States, and he keeps complaining about how all their crap breaks down, how nothing works, how their trucks keep breaking down, and so on and so forth. He's not, and he's an operator on the system, so you think he ought to know. But the Ukrainians have found or seem to be operating these quite well and quite efficiently. And one thing is, they're putting the systems we're sending them to good use. They're manufacturing more themselves. They're manufacturing more remote control systems, drones, boats, so on, and remote control boats, speedboats. They are very innovative. And you have to say something. You say the same thing about the Russians. You say the same thing about the Polish. They are very innovative people. They're very creative. They make things work. And somebody wrote about what happens to all the stuff that uh, Raymond. Hold on that thought for a minute. They're very good at making things where what happened to all the stuff that gets blown up. Every single thing that gets blown up by the Ukrainians or the Russians, every piece of equipment that gets partially destroyed on the battlefield, the Ukrainians, a lot of that's been left on Ukrainian soil. They will strip everything they can use to fix, repair, or build anew. Tanks, wheels, anything. And that's why you have like the T-55 and the T-72 interchangeable. Wheels, parts of the engine, a lot of the parts are the same. They all have the same equipment, but the Ukrainians are improvising a lot. They're making do with what they have. And then you start seeing, well, the Russians. I've seen Russians bolt rocket launchers, like rocket pods from helicopters to pickup trucks or to APCs, and make all these weird battlefield things they've created to make something work. And so, well, with the Russians are such a great and mighty army, where they should just be able to pull everything out of storage if they needed something else. Why are the Russians being forced to improvise and do strange field creations for their fight? The Ukrainians, yes, they're trying to make do with everything they get. They're until they get more, and we have to keep sending them more because we started that process. We started training them. We started giving them arms, slowly replacing their package with a Western package. So now we are bought into this. Should I think that has NATO sent the pre-precision vehicles and warehouses? I doubt it. I think we have a lot more equipment we could have sent them, but before we send things, we also have to make sure that the Ukrainians are fully trained on operating them, and that is a big deal because same thing with the F-16s. We are training. We are training pilots. We are training tankers. We are training Ukrainians on artillery systems and various other things. Which means that next year, and unfortunately, I think the war will last very well into next year. You might see another generation of well-trained Ukrainian soldiers come into the mix. Now, Stefan, you had a question that I almost forgot previous. Where is it? Where's that question, buddy? Come on, I just saw your question here. When did the bombing pipeline release the official version? Oh, well, we know who bombed the pipeline. Yeah, I'm sorry. I hate to say it, but I still think we did it. I just don't see why the Russians would. I just no. Stefan, where's that question? I promise to just take from you. God damn it. Was that you, Simon? Uh, and that's another thing is when you start looking at pictures of destroyed Western equipment in Ukraine. Believe me, they are milking this every which way. There it is, every which way. You'll see the same APC destroyed from 20 different angles, and then they'll claim 20 of them destroyed. I get all those pictures too, and sometimes I see, yeah, that's the same vehicle as this picture number 2 and number 4. Um, Equipment gets sent, get destroyed. Of course it does. The Russian standoff rocket systems on their helos will destroy them at a far distant, greater range that we could take them down unless we get more HIMARS and get more stuff on flying cabinet before them. It's just it's war, attrition, destruction. Will take its toll, and stuff's going to break down. We sent it to war. We don't send it for it to not. It's doing its job. Did it save the crew? That's the thing that's really important. Did the equipment get destroyed, but did the crew survive? That's the question that's really important. Prigozhin's coup, Raymond, Prigozhin wasn't trying to get rid of Putin. He was trying to get rid of Shoigu. And I think that is a distinction that has to be made. I'm sorry. I'm running out of voice myself. It's absolutely. He was not trying to get rid of. He was trying to get rid of what he sees or claim to be the corrupt members of the Russian military leadership, and he's probably not entirely wrong. Although I think he overplayed his hand quite significantly, and he was most certainly curbed from it. You remember the day before his dash to Moscow, he was the second most popular person in Russia, and they managed to repaint that picture. And I think that has something to do with it, because the second most popular person in Russia may be even talked about. He might be the next to take over leadership after Putin. And if you are a maybe not 100% believer in democracy like Putin might be, he may see that as a bit of a threat. Stalin didn't like it. Hitler didn't like it. Anybody who's too popular needs to be cut down. But he still needed him, so he's still alive. I think that is, if this was a crisis that was set up for Wagner to do this in order to cut Prigozhin down, or it was Prigozhin just going off on a limb on his own, and then Putin using this to put him down, popular-wise, well, the results are still the same. The potential leadership threat to Putin was dismantled. But I don't think it was ever Prigozhin's intention to oust Putin in any which way. He even said so. Some of the Wagner guys, the one Wagner post said that they're going to change leadership soon or something. There was one guy. That was not what Prigozhin said. Anyway, like the agreement on the vast military support for the Donbass by Russia. Though, I mean, the Donbass as a whole, like I said, I think we need to accept that there are some Ukrainians that lean east, and there are some Ukrainians that lean west, and I think that's where the demarcation line is going to eventually going to fall, whether we like it or not. Let's see, what did you say? All right, so we're coming to the end because I'm losing my voice. I can see. I don't know why. And you all know that I have guests on this show because I want to hear their opinions, not because I necessarily agree with people's opinions, but because I want to hear different opinions. I have no problem hearing people say things that I don't agree with or that you don't agree with, but we still have the right to hear them out. And I think we can, at least on this channel, run a full level of democracy. Right. All right. Yes, Putin is still popular. Well, there's still people that will vote for Biden. I'm sorry. The political connections between, sadly, both parties in America and Ukrainian oligarchs and money and politics, which will then inevitably also involve intelligence, I think is the wild card here. Because there is a political interest in Ukraine from the U.S. probably from other European leaders as well. Certainly, we have an effective leadership in the States that has an interest, a personal economic interest and financial interest in what's going on in Ukraine. That is not helping matters at all. And I could see this war last until these people are soundly defeated politically or out of office, whether it's being in Washington or Moscow. And I don't know. I honestly haven't really dove into. I have not dived into. Apparently, I definitely can't talk. I haven't dived into political internal politics right now because I try to stay out of politics entirely. But there are certainly some problems in Ukraine internal that needs to be cleaned up. And I'm not just saying that because of what you see in the news, but because I know what some of my friends are being offered to work as doing in Ukraine that has something to do with the children and trafficking to some degree, legal or other. I hear things and I see things that are deeply disturbing, and that sort of ties into more that's going on politically here. And until it's not really for me to break that story, but there's some political interests where these politicians need to go away in the West. And I think because of their vested personal interests in Ukraine is why this is going on as long as it has. Bruno, thank you, damn it. Oops, what the hell did I do? Thank you, my brother. I appreciate it. I really do. Especially since I just had to buy a new computer since the other one became obsolete the moment I installed my other one. We'll talk about the evils of Apple one of these days. Like I said, there's a lot more to this that we can talk about, and we will, but it's time to go do other things today, and that's what we're going to go do. And I got to start editing because I need to get an episode up for you guys this weekend. I'm going to try to I'm working on quite a lot of detailed episodes on Ukraine where I'm going to try to break down, and I'm going to try to break down the numbers of production and money and all this stuff, because it is so hard to see through that was, well, who's losing most people, who's manufacturing the most, who's got the most, there's so many factors in this that is not black and white, and it certainly is not being truthfully replicated on the news, because that what you see on the news seems to sell into one side or the other side based on whatever agenda they seem to have. And that's not really helping the very truth on the way. That's why I went to Ukraine, because I want to sit there and see what is the mindset. And the mindset of the Ukrainian people is to fight very seriously and very hard. It is actually very inspiring to see. And I don't see that same passion in the Russian soldiers. And I think that is maybe what it boils down to. And then we can spend the rest of our lives as historians afterwards to try to dissect why this happened and who's to blame, because there's a lot of people to blame, not just Putin to blame for this. There's a lot of entities to blame for this. And I doubt, honestly, most of them will ever be taken into account of this, including the Russian 134th that killed at least 26 civilians in Bakhmut, not Bakhmut, in Kiev, outside Kiev, where they shot them in the back of the head and used their cell phones to call their girlfriends afterwards. Don't come here and tell me that they're all behaving nicely. They're not. And that will spiral the thing out of control to where atrocities are going to be met with more atrocities, and this has to stop because that doesn't go anywhere. Anyway, we'll talk more about this. Joseph and I will come on. Joseph will come on and talk about Ukraine as well over the next couple of weeks. And the thing we found in the Siemens thing, well, there's no update to that. Paul is working on the graphics. I found something more radioactive, but we'll get more on that. And yes, Ukrainian girls are beautiful and some of them can sing, but we'll get back to that as well. You all take care. And remember, always be open-minded and listen to what everybody has to say, because we have to hear pros and cons to understand the full picture and to understand what people are thinking. We have to listen to them, all of them. Be well, be safe, have fun, and good night, or have a good coffee.